comments in response to EPA's proposed 2014 renewable fuel volume percentages under the Renewable Fuel Standard program. First created in 2005, the RFS has been an important tool for rural economic development and emissions reduction, and has been a cornerstone policy in our nation's effort to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Despite the nation's jump in domestic crude oil production via the utilization of various exploration and recovery techniques, we must remember that fossil fuels are a finite resource. And if we are to achieve a 25 by 25 renewable energy future or other renewable energy goal, we must pursue a portfolio approach to meet future energy needs. Those who want to completely repeal the RFS choose to ignore the consumer price benefits of biofuels in the marketplace, choose to ignore the hundreds of thousands of jobs already created by the biofuels industry, and they choose to ignore how our energy security is compromised with nearly every occurrence of some sort of geopolitical unrest in the Middle East or other countries around the world. The RFS has been a functioning and has been meeting the public policy goals that Congress envisioned. And our national research labs, our universities, and private sector innovators have been working to make our biofuel choices more efficient, more robust, cleaner, and even more sustainable. And the seeds of cutting-edge research and commitment investments in next-generation biofuels are now sprouting forth. But we need the regulatory certainty of the Renewable Fuel Standard to ensure an open market, or an industry will lose the momentum for which it has worked so hard to attain, and consumers in rural America will suffer. To help us provide a deeper dive into details of the RFS and how it's driving the development of advanced biofuels, joining us today is Mike McAdams, President of the Advanced Biofuels Association. The ABFA consists of over 40 advanced biofuel production, and feedstock companies who are developing and commercializing their technology to provide renewable, lower carbon fuels that will move our nation closer to achieving energy and economic security. Mike? As you see, there's additional information about Mike on the screen, his experience. But at this time, I'm going to turn the controls over to Mike and allow him to provide today's opening presentation.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Helene. Delighted to join all of you from around the Southeast today. I'm in cold Washington, D.C. I don't know what's colder, the weather out or the politicians up on the Hill, but having said that, I'm going to try to take the first chunk and walk you through a little of the history of the RFS, and I want to take you through some of the specifics of how the statute actually works. And I'm going to talk to you specifically about the RVO and the proposed rule that EPA's put out, and we'll talk about why that's such a damaging proposed rule as it currently sits. So let me just jump right in, and I look forward to your questions, Helene, whenever the time calls for questions. You let me know. So let me see if I can get this to work.
No problem, Mike.
All right. I can't get it to, can you move the next slide? Okay, so this is just a slide of the member companies of ABFA, and it gives you a good feel for the size and breadth. Many of the companies, we represent most of the major pathway technologies, from thermochemical to hydroprocessing to energy cane, a wide-ranging set of feedstocks such as giant miscanthus and others, and you see that on the slide here, and I thought that would give you guys some context. Next slide, please. Okay, good, I got it to work. All right, so when I wanted to go back and start with what the RFS-1 was, and even before the RFS-1, the effort by the United States Congress to begin to put oxygenated fuels in gasoline goes all the way back to 1990 and the last time we revised the Clean Air Act, which was in 1990. And that called for a 2% mandate of oxygenated fuels and reformulated gasoline. And reformulated gasoline was the control mechanism that the Act allowed for two different types of areas in the United States. One was CO non-attainment areas, which was in the winter, and that called for 2.7% oxygenate in wintertime gasoline because the RVP of wintertime gasoline is higher and you don't have volatility issues. And then ozone non-attainment areas, which is principally a summertime problem where the oxygen level was 2%. And what that led to was, by the time of around 2005, when we passed the RFS, what it led to was an oxygenated market over 5 billion gallons, of which 4.7 billion by 2005 was methyl tertiary butylethylene. It was what they call MTBE. And so there were groundwater issues that arose in the courts of law, and there was political backlash, which began in California. And so a political agreement was reached by the oil industry and the renewable fuels industry, along with the environmental community and the agriculture community, and it gave birth to the Renewable Fuel Standard. And so the original Renewable Fuel Standard is depicted in terms of gallons. You see it on this graph here. And it called for a graduated increase in the volume of renewable fuels in the transportation fuels pool in the United States. And it went from 2006, as you can see here, to 2012, and it called for 7.5 billion gallons in the overall renewable of renewable fuels in the overall fuels pool. Now let me put that into context. 2008 was our high watermark year for the number of gallons of fuel used since 2008 because of the economy and because of the change of fleets and vehicles in their CAFE, the corporate average fuel economy of those vehicles on the highways. You've seen a decrease in the overall demand for gasoline in the United States. But when you look at where this was, it was 7.5 billion gallons by 2012, and because it was just one general line, and you'll see the difference when I move to the depiction in the slides of the Renewable Fuel Standard 2, you had what the EPA adopted, which was called an energy density and equivalency factor. And the reason that was developed was because if I made biodiesel and I put it into gasoline and I put it into diesel in 2007 or 2008, I got to credit my biodiesel against the 7.5 billion gallons because it was a transportation fuel. That's how the program worked. And the energy density and equivalency program was, the EPA decided, well, it wasn't really equitable. If I made a higher energy density fuel versus that of ethanol, I need to give them a little more credit. And so in the RFS 1, EPA developed an energy density and equivalency set of calculations which multiplied against the number of gallons, which was then how you complied with meeting the overall targets. It got placed against the target. So I've got a later slide that I can show you specifically some of the energy densities, but for purposes in the RFS 1, what it does is did, for example, if I made biodiesel, I would multiply it times 1.5, and so for every gallon of biodiesel, I would get 1.5 RINs as an obligated party if I used it against the 7.5 billion gallon mandate. So it gave them a little bit of a kick up. When you move to the completion of the RFS 2, and the RFS 2 was passed, and we had switched the leadership between the passage of the 2005 Act, which was done under the chairmanship of Joe Barton in the Energy and Commerce Committee, a Republican. We now moved to the RFS 2 Act, which was passed in December of 2007 by a Democratic Congress who had just been elected, and signed into law by George Bush, George W. And as you see, what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a set of graphs that were identical to each other. So what you see is the original graph was 2006 to 2012, up to 7.5 billion. And you can see the new program runs all the way to 2022, and it's 36 billion gallons of which 21 billion gallons was intended to come from advanced biofuels. And you can see what it did was it took the 7.5 billion gallon target in 2012, right? And it raised the 7.5 billion gallon target to almost, I believe it was 12 billion gallons if you look at it in 12. So it raised the original 7.5 up, and it actually raised the original it doubled the original conventional pool from 7.5 to 15. You can see is denoted beginning in 2015, and it's capped and sustained through 2022. So this is probably my most famous slide. What I wanted to do so in one move I could depict how the RFS2 was different than the RFS1 is I wanted to put a slide together that showed how the pool worked. And because I've got the time, I'm going to actually talk to you and give you an example of nesting because most people don't appreciate the nesting impact. And as we get ready to write our comments on the RVO, I think you'll find nesting is a key component. So when you look at the RFS2, it's a 36 billion gallon total pool. 15 is conventional. In the specific statute, there are specific target mandates that are in the statute for conventional fuel, which is depicted as corn ethanol as a conventional fuel. Fuel from corn feedstock is limited to the conventional pool. And then we developed, the Congress in their intent to try to develop more innovative second and third generation technologies moved to an advanced pool. And that pool is 21 billion gallons. They created a biomass-based diesel pool, which is really a diesel substitute pool. Today that is largely consists of biodiesel and renewable diesel. Moving forward, you'll see more and more renewable diesel coming into that number, and that number was adjusted in 2012 to be 1.28 billion gallons. And then there's a 16 billion gallon set of statutory mandates for cellulosic, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, the language in the statute specifically allows the EPA, should there be insufficient gallons of cellulosic available, to waive it in range with the court decision which was decided in 2012 to reflect that which is actually being produced. Additionally, it's important to note that EPA may issue cellulosic waiver credits for compliance relative to the targets they lay down in the RVO. So let me move to the next slide, and I may come back to this slide for a minute. So the current EPA proposal that was released in November of last year is depicted in the first line, and this is very similar to the leaked document. The proposal for the first time actually lowers the overall obligation. The 13 obligation, which was met, was 16.55 billion in the renewable pool, which is it's the aggregation of all the pools put together. The original statute, as you can see on line 1, that was passed by Congress and signed into law, was to raise it from 16.55 to 18.15, of which they considered 1.75 billion gallons would be cellulosic. That is a number we will not meet this year. But so in response, the EPA, as you can see, lowered it almost 3 billion gallons from the original statutory target, claiming they had the authority to lower the advanced pool using the cellulosic waiver authority and using the general waiver authority to lower the renewable pool. Those are both legally debatable points, and should this rule move forward in line with the numbers that were proposed in 14, I would predict to you the agency will be sued in several directions by many different people. The second line, which is the real bone of contention for the advanced biofuels community, is found in the advanced biofuels number. The 13 number was 2.75 billion. The 14 statute, the statute called for a 14 number to rise to 3.75. The actual proposed rule says between 2 and 2.5, but the number that they picked was 2.21 was the projected number they were going to pick. That number represents a 40% reduction from the 3.75 number. It represents a 500 million gallon reduction from the number last year, and the entire year's numbers are not completed on the EMTS system as yet, but we anticipate the number of RINs made and put on the system for 2013 will be somewhere around 3.2 billion gallons, far in excess of the target of 2.75, meaning there's at least 500 million gallons of carryover RINs that could be applied to the 3.75 number if they chose to leave the number the same number. So, you know, specifically, if we were to produce the same number of gallons and add 500 million to it, you'd have 3.75. That is why many in my industry have consternation about why would you lower it to 2.21 when you clearly are going to have, you did more than 3 billion gallons this year, and you've clearly got carryover RINs to add to it. The last number is the biomass-based diesel number. In our comments, we will suggest that EPA at least attach in the proposed rule the proposal of $1.28 billion in 14 and in 15 for the biomass-based diesel rule. This year, the EMTS system will reflect between renewable diesel, triglycerides, and biodiesels. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.7 billion gallons will actually be on the EMTS system, multiplied by a minimum factor of 1.5 to 1.7, somewhere around 2.55 billion RINs to be used in the advanced pool towards the 2.75 number, which is what happened in 13, way in excess of the 1.28. And so we think it's unreasonable for them to predict 15 here in front of 14. And the last one is they suggest 17 to 23 million in the cellulosic biofuels pool. The rule in 13 called for 6 million gallons. The statute called for 1.75 billion gallons. As you could see yesterday, EPA announced that they were going to waive the 6 million down to, I think it's 992,000 RINs were actually made, which were ethanol equivalent in 2013. And we anticipated that. So that was no big surprise, and we anticipate that. And then the fight between the corn ethanol community and EPA will surround the last piece, which is the statute calls for 14.4 billion gallons of conventional corn ethanol. The 13 number was 13.8. We actually are going to see probably at the end of the year 13.1 billion gallons of ethanol were actually used this year. The other 700 million were made from the overflow of biomass-based diesel and fuels that flowed into the D6 pool or the conventional pool because of the rising RIN and tax pieces such as biodiesel and renewable diesel that actually came in as conventional fuel. And then you see the proposed rule, which proposed cut from 14.4 down to 13.13. And the argument will be, the argument from EPA is they have sufficient general waiver authority because of the lack of production, lack of demand for gasoline, and the corn guys will argue that the statute was rather explicit in terms of mandating whether the production of supply was there, not the demand for gasoline. So 180 degrees apart, and that will certainly be the contention in the court of law. This is another way to depict what I just talked to you about in terms of the proposals back in the flow of the charts. The only thing I would want to caution you to not be confused about is the center bar, which is the 3.75. That would be for the advanced pool. There is no way that the cellulosic portion would bring in 1.75 billion. The most optimistic scenario for the advanced for the cellulosic pool involves the passage or the completion of the Pathways 2 rule, which would see biogas come in and bring as much as 100 to 175 million ethanol equivalent gallons on top of there are at least 3 or 4 cellulosic ethanol plants scheduled to come online within the reemergence of Keyor and the renewable diesel side as well. So a different way to depict it, but most of that red block would be made out of fuels that really come out of the orange space, over half of that, and then topped off with the others. One of our concerns is that if you didn't do the Pathways 2 rule prior to the passage of the RVO, you're going to flood it. You're not going to have a number that's sufficient to represent the production that's actually in place, and you'll destroy the RIN value, which will certainly not help those trying to finance the building of new plants. This is the nesting piece. I will stand back and wait on that a minute because that may be a little too detailed, but let's just suffice to say, if I make a biomass-based diesel, either a renewable diesel or a biodiesel, that is a D4. That's reflected on this chart. A D4 also gets credit in the D5 pool. So I make 1 million gallons of biodiesel. I get 1 million gallons towards the obligation in the 4 pool, which is 1.28. I get 1.5 million gallons towards the obligation in the advanced pool, which was supposed to be 3.75, and I get 1.5 million gallons towards the overall Renewable Fuel Standard obligation, which, according to EPA this year, is supposed to be 15.21. That is how the nesting works. That's a specific example of a fuel through the nesting process, and that has tremendous implications on how you should or should not set the RVOs. I talked earlier about the RFS1 and RFS2 in terms of energy density and equivalency. This gives you a set of examples of what the multipliers are for the various fuels. The bottom line is, if we don't get the right RVO, you're going to kill the investment future for the advanced biofuels production by crushing the RIN. Most of the fuels that I represent are fungible, so they don't have blend wall issues and have actually helped take pressure off the blend wall. And these are the fuels that have the higher GHG reductions. And what EPA basically did in terms of their proposed rule was they replaced 500 million gallons of higher GHG reduction fuels with fuels that could be grandfathered or less than 20% GHG reductions. Lastly, I wanted to just put a couple slides in here on major events. For those of you who don't know, most of the major airframes in the military have now been approved to fly on a number of drop-in renewable fuels from our industry. We've flown commercial airlines on several continents now, and we've flown most of the major jets from the military, the F-16, the F-18, as well as others. Lastly, the Great Green Fleet was the first use of a naval exercise with 22 nations participating. I was actually there to witness the fueling of the USS Princeton, which is the forefront on the right there, being fueled by the refueling tanker. It ran on 250,000 gallons of renewable marine fuel, marine diesel, made from algae through a hydroprocessing company. So it was Solazyme who provided the algae feedstock, and Tyson Petroleum Dynamic Fuels who made the fuel. So I'm going to stop there. I've given you a lot of information in a very quick period of time. I know it's detailed, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Helene.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Folks, we're going to hold off on questions until the end of the next presentation, just to ensure everybody has plenty of time to make their statements. And we'll be collecting those questions, and I think Helene is in the process of doing that. Is that correct, Helene?
Yes. If people have questions, please enter them in the chat window for everyone, or you can send it to me privately, and I will ask those at the end during the Q&A session.
Okay. Mike, I want to appreciate and thank you again for joining us for that thorough review of the RFS and for joining us today on this webinar. But stick around. I'm sure we'll have some discussion and some questions here at the end. Our next presenter is Rory Gopal. As some of you may know, a key component of the RFS, and as was alluded to by Mike, is the flexibility afforded obligated parties as to how they meet their annual renewable fuel obligation. They can do so by blending and actually using biofuel gallons, or through credits which can be purchased from other obligated parties. These credits are identified and tracked through a Renewable Identification Number and are known as RINs. Some of you may remember that we had a spell of RIN hysteria early in 2013 when RIN prices shot up in a matter of weeks. Some blame the RIN price run up on market speculators and RIN hoarders. Some say it was a result of the drought and the fear there would not be enough biofuels to meet the RFS. Others say it was market fundamentals driven by gasoline blend wall. Well, to help us learn more about and understand the functionality of RINs, we've invited Mr. Gopal of Carbon Solutions Group to guide us along the path of how a RIN attains market and financial value and is ultimately retired in the marketplace. Roy is located in Birmingham, Alabama, and is director of Carbon Solution Group's Biocommodities Business Unit. And if I can figure out how to get it forward here, there we go. As I said, the Biocommodities Business Unit of Carbon Solutions Group, and he's responsible for overseeing technology evaluation and project development for the company's waste to fuels business. Roy's experiences in environmental asset consulting, biochemical production, and commodities trading has afforded him a wide-ranging perspectives on the vertically integrated waste to fuels market. Rory, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. So yeah, my objective today is to try to give you all some real life understanding and a view into what this commodity called a RIN is and how it functions in real time to help biofuel producers stay in business and be profitable, and how it also helps obligated parties attain compliance with RFS 2. So the main topics that I'm going to discuss are, at first I'm just going to talk a little bit about the RIN Basics, talk about a few definitions that are pertinent. Then I'll talk about, I guess, what I'm calling the life of a RIN, walking you from feedstock all the way to the RIN being used by an obligated party to attain compliance. Next, I'll talk about RIN valuation, what impacts pricing, and what pricing has been in the recent history of the market. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the cost of overall compliance to the obligated parties, and then potentially the cost that those obligated parties might choose to pass on to consumers. And then finally, because there has been a lot of issues over the last few years related to RIN fraud, and I'm going to talk a little bit about RIN surety and the steps the market has taken to ensure that the RINs being traded are real RINs. So first, RIN Basics. So an obligated party is basically defined as a refiner or an importer of diesel or gasoline amounting to greater than 75,000 barrels per day of crude. And that's a general number. There are some asterisks to be applied there, but that gives you a general idea. Basically, we're talking about basically 25 to 35 companies. Next, when we talk about generation of a RIN, we're talking about RIN that is produced, sold, and consumed in the United States. So if biofuels exported from the United States, actually the exporting entity becomes an obligated party, in that they have to retire a RIN. They have to give up a RIN because RINs are really to count the amount of fuel, renewable fuel, that's been produced and consumed in the United States. Next is the D code. And Michael talked a little bit about D codes, but basically this is how we tell which RIN is what in the trading market. The most commonly traded RINs are D4s, biodiesel, or biomass-based diesel, the D5s, advanced biofuels, and the D6s, which typically means corn ethanol. And I'll dig a little bit deeper into the types of fuels and the prices of RINs later in the presentation. Assigned RINs. So when a biofuel is produced, the initial RIN, initial form of that RIN is an assigned RIN. That RIN is assigned to a gallon of ethanol equivalent biofuel. And from a commodity transaction standpoint, it is literally bound to that biofuel in terms of the documentation for passing ownership of biofuel from a producing facility to the buyer of the fuel, whether it be a blender or a consumer. The second type of RIN, the second delineation the form a RIN can take is a separated RIN. There are certain events which cause the RIN to become its own independent commodity that can be traded without any conversation of the underlying fuel. And this is blending biofuel is the most typical way for a RIN to become separated and to become a standalone commodity. And really, very quickly, in terms of some of the fraudulent aspects of RINs, really we're talking about RINs that have become separated from fuel and therefore are subject to duplicitous parties. And then finally, when we talk about vintage, we're talking about the year in which the RIN was generated. It's important to consider that a RIN generated in this calendar year can also be used for compliance in the next calendar year. So a 2014 vintage RIN from biofuel produced today would be able to be used for compliance by an obligated party for their 2014 needs, but also for their 2015 needs. So the life of a RIN. Really, the life of a RIN begins with the feedstock acquisition, and this is maybe an aspect of how RINs impact listeners to this webinar. As you may own either a cellulose, a starch, or a sugar, or a fat, and with the growing biofuel market, those commodities may find their way to a biofuel plant. So it's important for you, obviously, to understand what a RIN is and what it's valued at, because that helps you understand what the value of your commodity is. Next is the feedstock tracking at the biofuel plant, delineating what type of biomass we're talking about is very important because that impacts the type of RIN that's going to be generated at the facility. Next is biofuel production. So when the fuel is finally produced and it comes to the point where it's going to be commercially traded, that is typically when the RIN is generated. So there's generally a meter on a tank where you make your biodiesel, you make your cellulosic diesel, or you make your corn ethanol, or you, if in an importer's case where you import a quantity of fuel, that production, and I guess I should say production and importation, because RINs can be generated from biofuel imported to the United States from countries like Brazil and Colombia and Malaysia, et cetera. That's the point where the RIN is actually generated. And when that RIN is generated, it's typically done, well, it's always done now on the EPA's moderated transaction system. At the beginning of RFS 1, RINs were basically long, 38 character codes which were produced to represent a quantity of RINs that were literally traded in Excel spreadsheets. So if I'm a plant manager at a biodiesel plant, we make 7,000. We fill up our feedstock tank and we make 10,000 gallons of biodiesel that day. I'm going to go sit down at my computer and I'm going to use various identifying numbers, for instance, for my plant, for my company, the date, the quantity of RINs in that 10,000 gallon batch, and I would have authored effectively a 38-digit code to represent that fuel, and that became the RIN. I dropped that in an Excel spreadsheet. After, say, a month's worth of production, I now have an Excel spreadsheet with 30 numbers on it, and assuming that these RINs have been separated by, for instance, blending, I would then trade that with, for instance, an obligated party. That's the way that it used to work. This was, of course, fraught with opportunities to make mistakes, but also opportunities for people to break the law. So the EPA innovated in 2010 when RFS2 came online with their moderated transaction system. So the EPA has something called the CDX, and that is effectively the online platform that they use for various types of reporting, not just RFS2. And within that is the moderated transaction system, where now one person at that biofuel facility would log on to that website and actually generate the RIN. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the biodiesel producer segment of the presentation. So once the RIN has been generated, it can then be transferred. Again, that used to occur by sending an Excel spreadsheet. Now that occurs on a secure website, supervised by the EPA. The next step is really typically when the biofuel is sold, it goes to another place where it's blended with diesel, and biodiesel, for instance, is blended with diesel, or ethanol is blended with gasoline, or, for instance, renewable diesel is dropped in with traditional diesel. But basically, this is the point of incorporation of the fuel into the commercial, the wholesale fuel infrastructure. This typically happens at a wholesale petroleum terminal. I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the blending aspect of the presentation. And then finally, I'll talk about how the RIN is actually used by the obligated party and what impacts their decision whether or not to buy a RIN and what price to pay for it. So, biofuel producer. The first step, if you're interested in one day generating biofuel at your facility, is to register your facility with the EPA. You'll get a third party to come in and to do what they call an engineering review. This third party engineering review will basically represent that your plant is standing there and it exists as you are purporting to the EPA that it exists. It is able to produce the fuel that you purport that it can produce. And once that engineering review, along with your registration documents, are supplied to EPA between 60 days and 6 months, sometimes later, you would receive a company ID and a plant and a facility ID. These IDs would then enable you to have access to the EPA's moderated transaction system, where you would be able to generate RINs. So once your plant is registered with EPA, then you can start producing fuel that qualifies for the generation of RINs. So you then purchase your feedstock. So the biodiesel guy goes and makes a deal with Tyson to buy some chicken fat, or with Hormel to buy bacon fat, or Cargill to buy soybean oil, or Darling International to buy waste veg. And part of the price that they pay for that feedstock is tied to the value of the RIN. So as the price of RINs go up or down, Cargill and Darling and Tyson and Hormel and their representatives have an eye on that price of a RIN, and they will oftentimes change the price of that commodity feedstock to reflect a rallying RIN market or a dropping RIN market. So there's no free lunch, or it's very, very hard to find a free lunch where a producer of the commodity doesn't, the commodity feedstock that is in ethanol and in biofuel doesn't have a good, biodiesel, excuse me, doesn't have a good understanding of the value of a RIN inherent in that. Now, cellulose is an area where, because there's been such a small amount of biofuel produced from cellulose, where there is some disconnect between the owner of that cellulose feedstock and the producer of the RIN. And ideally, that's one of the bridges that we're going to help, one of the gaps that will help bridge today. So once the biofuel plant manager produces the biofuel and certifies it in his tank, he then sits down at his laptop and he logs on to his EMTS account, and he's going to go through 6 or 7 screens where he clicks various drop-down boxes that describe the gallon of fuel that he made, effectively going through the same process that he used to go through when he compiled that 38-character code. Now, instead of having that code, that gallon is just described within EMTS and moved as a quantity of a specific type of RIN originating from a specific facility. So those characteristics are now attached to that RIN. The next step is to generate a product transfer document. So this is just basically a document that describes, a physical document that describes the RIN, and it is generally passed via email the same time that the RIN is passed on the EMTS system. Generally, in today's market, that biofuel is moved with that RIN, so a separate document. For instance, a bill of lading on a 6,500 gallon trailer of biodiesel is going to move via email along with that product transfer document, which describes the RINs, along with the contract that dictates the price that those two commodities are moving together, along with the transaction on the EMTS system. So all that generally occurs within 24 hours of the deal being made and the biofuel being produced. And a key here too is all of these documents that I'm describing are audited by a third party annually, and that's called an audit attest, an attest engagement, where a third party comes in and looks at these documents and checks to make sure that the documents, the physical documents, actually match what occurred, what was represented to have moved on the EMTS system. So next, really quickly, the biofuel generally is going to move from the production facility, whether it be a corn ethanol facility in Des Moines, Iowa, or a biodiesel facility in Atlanta, Georgia. Generally going to move right now by rail or by truck to a wholesale petroleum terminal, and this is basically a gas station for gas stations. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. They are typically situated where diesel and gasoline pipelines run. So that their business is generally to buy gasoline and buy diesel out of the pipeline from the refineries that produce it on the Gulf Coast or in the Midwest or wherever it's produced, and sell it by the 6,000 or 7,000 gallon truckload to distributors who then haul it to gas stations and sell it to those individual gas stations or travel centers to be consumed by the public. So ethanol and biodiesel, and I tend to focus on these because they are the most common types of renewable fuels that we encounter in the physical market today. Not the only ones, but the most common, are then blended at that wholesale terminal in tanks ranging from the smallest tank tanks ranging from 200,000 or 300,000 gallons to 3 or 5 or 7 million or 10 million gallons. The ethanol is blended into gasoline, or the biodiesel is blended into diesel fuel. This can occur in either the tank owned by the wholesaler, the guy that owns that real estate, owns the gas station, or it can be throughputed, where an ultimate consumer of diesel or gasoline and ethanol and biodiesel might rent tank space because they don't have the real estate, but they want to bring in their own diesel or their own biodiesel or gasoline or ethanol. So they would throughput or lease tank space, and that's where they would take ownership of biodiesel and diesel and blend them, or ethanol and gasoline and blend them. Now, for biodiesel specifically, blending to lower than B80 allows for separation. So now the RIN can be traded as an independent commodity if it's blended below 80%. B5, so 5% biodiesel and E10 are obviously the most common blends. You know, there were times last summer where you probably in this country couldn't find many places where the fuel wasn't B5 or E10 by the time it got to the ultimate consumer. Some of the biggest blenders or throughputters, renters or leasers of tank space at these petroleum terminals, and therefore the most important entities in terms of allowing for biofuel and therefore RINs to get to market and become separated are Love's Musket, which is actually a vertically integrated company. You're probably very familiar with Love's Musket is their wholesale fuel distribution upstream business. Pilot Flying J that merged a couple of years ago, and Travel Centers of America. Without these companies, for instance, biodiesel really wouldn't be able to get to market and be used, used commercially. So a lot of times, one thing that we look at when we're trying to understand biodiesel consumption specifically, and also ethanol consumption, is what are those companies doing? Are they blending B20, which was very common last summer, especially in the South. You saw a lot of B16, and when I say B60, 16% biodiesel blended in diesel, 20% biodiesel blended in diesel by Love's Musket, Pilot Flying J, and TCA. But also, importantly, at these petroleum terminals are the integrated refiners, like Marathon, like BP, Shell, Chevron, et cetera, that own crude oil refineries, but also own the downstream infrastructure to bring that all the way to the terminal and ultimately to their branded stations, which may not be owned by them, but are definitely linked because of their fuel is mandated by contract in many cases to pass through those stations. Next, obligated parties. Obligated parties, like we've discussed, are the compliance parties that need the RINs. Some are vertically integrated, some are merchant. Vertically integrated meaning that they own the refinery, but they also own the terminal, and they have access to stations, either by owning them or by having contracts that require their brand of gasoline, diesel, biodiesel, or ethanol to be used or sold at that station. Merchant simply means they're a refiner. They put gasoline and diesel in the pipeline, but they don't have any capabilities downstream to impact the blending or consumption. And obviously the merchants are the ones that are sometimes hamstrung in the RIN market because they don't have the ability to get to blend aggressively. But they have to cover their percentage share of the total renewable volume obligation based on the amount of crude oil they refine or import. An obligation is incurred when diesel or gasoline is refined, imported, or biofuels exported. And there are some flexibilities. You can use, like I said, a past year's RIN for up to 20% of your current year's compliance. You can also carry forward a liability. RIN pricing factors, there are a lot of them. It's a complex market. The nested aspect that Michael discussed is very important when discussing the price for RIN. Historical RIN values, this is really just the last 2 years, the near history. Ethanol RINs have been worth next to nothing about a year and a half ago to as high as 143, currently 34 cents. Advanced biofuel has been a similar type of range, currently at 45 cents. And biodiesel RINs peaked a couple summers ago at $2.03, the highest price for RIN had ever traded, and that was during some RIN fraud. I don't want to call it panic, but panic. RIN surety, why should we be sure today that these RINs are legitimate? One is that third-party engineering, a an engineer has to show up, see the plant stands there, and put his stamp, his engineering stamp, that that's a legitimate facility and it's capable of producing the fuels that the owner says that it can. The EPA approval of that registration does, the EPA is looking at these engineering reviews and comparing them, and as they see more and more of these registrations, even the most complex ones, they're well-versed in types of fuel. The annual test engagement, a different third party than the third-party engineer, comes in each year, checks to make sure that the physical documents that you moved match what you say moved on EMTS. And then finally, a QAP, Quality Assurance Program. This is a new aspect of RFS2 that is going to be more of a real-time audit, which will give biofuel producers the ability essentially to have a real-time audit to represent that their RINs are legitimate. And then finally, individual obligated parties are starting to audit plants and do their own quality assurance programs. That's all I have today.
Rory, I certainly appreciate it. Appreciate the comprehensive overview of RINs and how they function, how they come to be, how they move through the system, and then, of course, some of the impacts, again, to how they're priced and what we have there. We will now, move to our Q&A and discussions and questions part of the program, the agenda. I know Helene's been taking a couple questions on the chat line there. We'll jump on those first. Helene, if there's anything that questions that you have in the queue that you want to present to these guys.
Sure. We actually have 2 questions. The first one is concerning feedstocks. I know Mike's more involved with policy and Rory with RINs, but hopefully they can answer this. The question is, for woody biomass in unmerchantable small diameter timber, during a clear cut, can the smaller diameter trees meet the EPA definition of slash? They also go on to say pretty much pulpwood, and they provided the size limits 4.5 to 9.5 diameters. Can trees smaller than 4-inch diameter be considered slash to qualify for RINs? And Rory, I'm not sure if you can answer this or.
I wouldn't speculate on that one. If Michael has an opinion.
Yeah, let me just help Rory. It's a great question, and the answer is it's like the definition of obscenity. I know it when I see it, right? And so when you go in, and by the way, Rory, really nice presentation. You covered an incredible amount of detailed material.
Appreciate that.
So when Rory talked about what you have to do as a facility to register to get a RIN, you file a Part 80. As an attorney, actually, I've done probably 20, 25 fuel certifications. And so the question here deals with the type of feedstocks that are allowed when you file your Part 80 irrespective of the process, which requires you to go back to the definition of what is a renewable woody biomass. And this has been an area of great consternation and ambiguity since the law was written in 2007, because the people that wrote the definitions had different objectives in terms of what they were trying to impact in terms of who could use what feedstocks, and the environmental community in terms of what they wanted to try to preserve in terms of particular forest. So the general rule of thumb is that you can use planted trees by mechanical mechanisms, but that you are prohibited for purposes of the RFS from using naturally regenerative woods. And so one of the things that is very confounding to a lot of my members who use woods with pyrolysis processes or thermochemical processes is you have a lot of naturally regenerative woods that are owned by private property owners, but those woods are excluded because they weren't mechanically planted and managed. So you wind up getting the treetops and limbs and trimmings when they get carved for pellets or for lumber or for wood floors, and those pieces are considered residues. But before I take any client in to do a Part 80, if they're going to use woods, I have a personal conversation with the specific pieces of wood that they're looking at in terms of meeting their overall demand. And we have a specific conversation as to whether EPA may or may not find that to be compliant before we file a Part 80.
Appreciate it, Mike. I think that goes to show the complexities around the definition of biomass, just not within the RFS, but in many federal policies.
Oh, and it's not consistent.
No, sir. Whether it's the Farm Bill, whether it's Renewable Fuel Standard, even within DOE's Office of Biomass, a lot of conflicting, confusing definitions around biomass, and it's quite naturally that feedstock suppliers are wrestling with these definitions and trying to determine compliance pathways.
And in many cases, it has stopped people from building plants with pulp mills because they had naturally regenerative woods that they owned, right? And those were non-compliant.
Helene, I think you said there was a second question out there.
Yes, we have questions. The second one is also another feedstock question, and this is in response to what feedstocks can be used to create RINs. I think we covered that with some of the definitions varying with different legislation, but in particular, this fellow wants to know, can RINs be created from municipal waste right now? Is anyone trading with the municipal waste?
It depends on the components of municipal waste. So like separated food waste, or if, for instance, like you say you're bagging your leaves, right, or you're cutting your grass, those are limbs from trees, right, thinnings. Those are all approved for use. If what you're going to do is try to pull all the plastic bottles out and put them through some kind of process like, for instance, Agilex, which would melt the plastic, the answer would be no. So it's very specific about what feedstocks can be used, and one of the real challenges in this section of the law is the cost of separation is sometimes so great that it makes it almost impossible to be competitive in terms of your overall feedstock cost just due to the requirement to separate.
Thank you, Mike. I'm also going to try to paste in a link to the EPA website. They do have some information there on some of the feedstocks and compliance and what counts, so that could be of use to the audience.
Well, they have look at the approved pathways list, and so when you go down that list, you can go on their website, like Helene is suggesting, and it'll show you which. So when you do a Part 80, you have to do three things, okay? And this is the way to think of this. You have to have an approved process. That's in your Part 80, the type of process, so that whatever your technology pathway is, whether it's fatty acid methyl ester, enzyme biodiesel, thermochemical pyrolysis, synthetic biology, algae squish, algae bioreactor, et cetera, there's a list of approved pathways, like gasification, for instance, cellulosic gasification. And then the second thing is there's an approved list of feedstocks, things like sorghum. But it's grain sorghum, not sugar sorghum. Or not biomass sorghum. Those haven't been approved yet. And then the last thing is there's a specific set of approved molecules. So ethanol is an approved molecule. Butanol is not approved yet as a molecule. Renewable diesel is an approved molecule. And naphtha is approved in some cases, but not in others. And so when you look at it, one of the confounding things for people that are trying to get a pathway approval is they have a technology that looks like, say, an algae technology, and they make a product that's an approved product, which is algae oil, but they're using a feedstock that's different than the one that's currently approved. And their question is, well, can I just apply for a Part 80 as an algae oil? Well, the answer is no if your feedstock is just, let's say, hypothetically sugarcane. So you've got to look. It's got to be looked at on that pathway. And unfortunately, the way EPA has been implementing the pathways is they've been very slow, and they've been requiring the feedstock, the molecule, and the process all to be on a similar line as an individual petition rather than taking a broader view. It's been a bit of a challenge.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I actually plan on having another webinar just to let people know on the feedstocks, how they're approved, going through the EPA process if you are a facility and what you need to do, and including life cycle analysis, the greenhouse gas emissions met. So that will be at another time. We'll dig more into that side of things. But I do have a question for Rory. Someone wants to know why is RIN pricing so heavily reliant on Brazil?
That's a good question. Because advanced biofuels are sort of the frontier right now. In lieu of actual, a lot of cellulosic production, the real frontier right now is still advanced biofuel, and the most reliable source aside from biodiesel is sugar ethanol, specifically from Brazil. So when pricing is right, when they call it the arbitrage is open, meaning when it's profitable to move sugar ethanol from Brazil to the United States, a lot of it moves, and it really can impact the supply, the overall supply of advanced biofuel. And because the year-over-year compliances are becoming tight, right? It used to be that there was clearly enough supply from the existing capacity. And as we transition into years where that may not be true anymore, 500 million RINs a year could be the difference between the market being flooded with the RINs and there being a panic because of scarcity. And for instance, Brazilian sugarcane ethanol is capable of bringing in about 500 million gallons ethanol equivalent a year. So, and maybe Michael could add to that.
Well, I think you gave a great answer, and I would say the most important thing, I'm going to challenge the assertion of the question. The most important thing for the value of the RIN is, what is the RVO target that EPA sets, which is why we're having absolute apoplexy over the low numbers that EPA is projecting to set for 2014. And what I was trying to give everyone in my slides was a feeling for, okay, if the number's 2.75 and it's unclear that we can hit the number, then the value of the D5 RIN, which is the advanced RIN, is going to be a little higher because the producers have got to queue it up at the end of the year so that they have their compliance numbers. And if they think in May that they may be tight at the end of the year, then it's going to drive that RIN value up, which is going to help the producers of the 4 pool, the 6 pool, the 4 pool, the 5 pool, the 3 pool, and the 7 pool, because they're all nested in the advanced biofuels pool. Now, the misconception is that Brazilian ethanol fills a majority of the advanced pool. That is factually incorrect. The reason that is factually incorrect is because we have a massive infrastructure in place already in the biodiesel world, and we're adding to it with renewable diesel. In addition, when you make renewable diesel, you also get about a 12% cut of naphtha. So you're beginning to see a number of fuels that qualify in the 5 pool, which are naphtha, or triglycerides, or other things outside of the 4 pool, which are gasoline substitutes, in addition to what we did last year, which was 1.7 billion gallons in the biomass-based diesel pool, and with the multipliers, you're over 2.5 billion of the 275 requirement. That squeezes the Brazilians because you don't need that many gallons to comply. It's just the cheapest compliant route. So when you look at the RVO rule as proposed by EPA, one of the arguments we'll be making in opposition to EPA is you are trying to use the cellulosic waiver authority because it's very wide and easy to use, to back out Brazilian ethanol, all to try to preserve corn ethanol in the renewable pool. And what you're doing is you're crushing the RIN value of the very fuels the statute intended to create in the first place, which were those that delivered higher GHG reductions and those in the advanced and cellulosic pool. So that to me is the answer to your question.
Thank you, Mike. Rory, do you have anything else to put in or add to that? Because I have one more question from the audience. We're about to run out of time here. What is the quality assurance mechanisms that are in place to ensure that compliance is done during production? I believe you did mention something about third-party certification. Or is that correct, or is there more to it?
Michael, you want to speak to that as well? I know there's new legislation that speaks.
Well, there's a quality assurance program rule that we were supposed to have at the end of the year. We're still waiting on it. But here's the bottom line, and Rory knows this as well as I do. So I'm a producer. I'm a little guy. I'm Wiesel in Florida, and not many people know me, and I'm only a $20 million company, and I'm going to sell my RINs to Pilot, or I'm going to sell them to Muscat, right? Or I'm going to sell them to Trade, or I'm going to sell them to ExxonMobil or Marathon, which are behemoth multi-billion-dollar companies. And they don't want to take the liability because they don't know these guys and they're too little, and they want to make sure that that RIN they buy, it's not going to be invalid. And so they go to Genscape, or they go to Murex, or they go to Weaver, members of mine, and they enter into a contract where they indemnify the purchasing party of the RIN from any liability should there be any problem with it being invalidated. And all of those organizations, there's QAP A and QAP B, so there are different levels of scrutiny that they have to go through depending on the size and viability of the companies. And so what they do is they basically act as an insurance program for people purchasing RINs so they don't wind up buying, multiple millions of RINs and then having them be invalid, and then they have to replace those RINs and they're out the money because the RINs are expensive.
All right. Well, since we're running out of time, thank you, Mike and Rory, for your presentations and providing some great answers to the questions. Folks, on participants, if you want to ask any more questions, just please type them in the chat window. I will email them to the presenters and they can get back with you. But now what we're going to try to do is get Douglas Durante on the phone to say a couple of concluding remarks. And I'm going to try to dial him in.
Well, I think we just, oh, there she is. Hey, Helene.
Brent, I'm not sure if that's going to work this time around.
Yeah, I didn't know that call-in user 12, you think can maybe unmute that one? I don't know what kind of tools you have to do.
I tried to unmute it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this Durante?
Yeah, I'm on. I've been on.
Oh,
Hey,
I'm
can you
sorry.
hear me?
Yes, we can.
No, I think you just punched the right button and unmuted me. So if you can hear me, I'm great. Well, I'm so sorry I couldn't get on the screen. I had some mechanical problems here. But yeah, I enjoyed the presentations of Rory and Mike, and they certainly know what they're talking about. I just to help wrap this up, I mean, we're almost on the eve of the close of the comments here of the volume obligations and the RFS, and the RINs are a central part of it. And as I listen to this and think about it, having been involved in this for a long time, the RINs, in my mind, were both the best thing and at times have been the worst thing about the whole RFS program. The beauty of the RINs were that they were put in place so that when the petroleum industry said we do not want to have to do this anywhere at any particular time or a particular place, the thinking was great. You meet your obligation through credits. You could overblend somewhere else or not blend at all and buy them from somebody else. So in theory, they were a great thing, and it was the ultimate in flexibility. But they have, in fact, been, and I think Rory said it before, it was indeed a panic that drove those prices up, and I think that is large part what's caused the rule to be proposed in the way that it has, because we've seen Office of Management and Budget and other agencies, really freak out about this, and the Hill did too. And when they had the hearings last year, the prices were driven up artificially, like any speculative commodity to drive the prices up and make it look bad. So they have turned out to work against us, and that's a shame because both there's limits to what ethanol can do, there's limits to what some of the advanced fuels can do, and I think it is distracting all of us from the big picture. And we work with a lot of you guys at 2525, and I'm sure you share our frustration that in all of this we've lost sort of the high ground, and nobody's saying, hey, these things are good, these renewable fuels are good, we need to figure this out, we need to work a better system, maybe we need to make some adjustments that makes everybody happy. But unfortunately it's been a lot of infighting, and within that people are forgetting that renewable fuels are good. The original goals of the program are, like I said, are being lost a little bit. So I think, if everybody keeps that in mind, and if you were to do any comments at the last minute, which is very easy to do, there's many templates out there to get letters in or brief comments or pick on a couple of issues. But I think the overarching theme that any communication to EPA should be that the RFS is a good program. It should stay intact. The EPA is undermining this with what they're doing, and the fear of RINs, as I said, is very much behind this, and there's a paper trail to prove that. But if we go back and the uncertainty they're creating by pulling these numbers back are certainly not helping. And we've got to fight this battle on a higher ground with health and environment and climate and carbon reductions, and so it's I just don't feel like they are trying very hard to fix this. And the only good thing about the proposal that's out there now is, to some degree, it staved off what could have been really ill-advised legislation or some legislative effort that might have really gutted this program. So that's only one good thing, but the bad part is it overweighs the good part. So I think anybody interested in this should weigh in on the issue. And as we said, the RINs are make that observation that they were put in to make this flexible, and they should, and it's just not been the whole issue. It's just been sort of confused a bit. And I'll leave you with this one thought, you guys. That you wonder why this is such a contentious issue. We were running some numbers the other day, and before the RFS, the petroleum industry, back in the early part of this decade, the 2000 decade, 2004, 2005, the gasoline market back then was 145 billion gallons. And so they were looking at an RFS. If you had 10 billion gallons, they're still left with 135. And so now, with gasoline declining, 2030 projected decreases in the whole gasoline pool to be maybe all the way down to 110. And if you take 30 of that away from biofuels, then they're left with a 77 billion gallon market. So that's almost cut in half. So you can understand why this is problematic, and driving up RINs and waving that around as a penalty or a fee or a fine and showing that to members of Congress who don't like EPA anyway is that's in their interest to do so. So anyway, that's really how we're viewing this, and I would again just close by saying that the RINs could be an extremely valuable tool. They should be, but people will work harder to solve that problem and all the problems with the RFS if we can get back as a community and reestablish the value. So, well, this is worth fixing. This is worth the benefits of a renewable slate like we're talking about here across the board. Makes it way worth, doing this and fixing this up. So let's keep our fingers crossed and hope we can get them to make some changes in this final rule.
Oh, thank you, Durante.
Yeah.
I believe we need to finish now so people can close out and do their continuing education credits. I would personally like to thank everyone myself for joining. Thank you, Michael McAdams, Rory Goebel, Brent Bailey. You guys did a great job. I think this is a very informative webinar. It's very been informative for me as well that there is a lot of interest in feedstocks. So I will be working on the next webinar to address that. So Brent, closing remarks before we go?
Oh, that's it. I was definitely going to thank the presenters as well. I'm glad we're able to scoot Doug in at the last minute. And as Helene said, watch out for future webinars and the transitioning from the bucket to the barrel series. I know she's got some exciting things planned out for the rest of the year, and we hope everyone will join us again. So I'll turn it back over to you there, Helene.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Mike, Rory, Douglas, and everyone else. You guys have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.